Hey everyone, I'm Ian Scott Cohen, your host and personal growth coach. Welcome to the Growth Coach podcast, where each episode I share actionable strategies and insights from positive psychology, self-improvement, and performance coaching to help you overcome setbacks, set ambitious goals, and really just think and feel like the best version of yourself. My goal with each episode is to leave you feeling energized and empowered so you can get back out there and live the life you've imagined for yourself. For more growth coaching tips and strategies, follow me on Instagram at Ian Scott Cohen or visit my website, ianscottcohen.com, for more info about my coaching programs. But for now, let's sit back and dive into this episode of The Growth Coach. Okay, so today we're going to kick off a multi-part series on building and breaking habits. I'm really stoked for this because this is something that I think is so relevant and will resonate with pretty much all of you who are tuning in. That's because the habits and routines that make up our lives largely define who we are and the type of lives we end up living, right? And so if you're tuning into my show, then you are someone who definitely still has aspirations to grow and achieve new personal or professional goals. Maybe you want to learn a new instrument or go backpacking in South America. Maybe you want to start a nonprofit organization or lose weight. Maybe you want to move up in your career, or maybe you want to find a new one altogether. Regardless of what your aspirations are, though, they all require growth and change to achieve. So if you want to learn an instrument or a language, you need to practice, right? If you want to go backpacking or start a new venture, you need to research and prepare and then take action. Lots and lots of action. If you want to lose weight, you need to change what you eat and how you move each day. You get the idea, obviously. So achieving our aspirations largely comes down to our ability to build or break habits. Because all we have is today, right? All we have is this moment and what we choose to do with our time each day. And then over time, our achievements are really built and arrived at. But if you're like me and pretty much everyone else in the world, you know that building and breaking habits is a lot harder than it sounds. I mean, first off, who has the time to build new ones, right? After a long day's work, you have so little energy. If you have a relationship, you want to put time into that. If you've got other obligations for family or friends, you've got to put time into that. And so as you get older, as we become more, older in our lives and into our careers, it gets really hard to convince ourselves that we even have the energy to put into building or breaking habits. So we'll get to that in this series for sure. And plus, I bet, like me, you've tried. Time and again, you've tried a new strategy, you've bought a new organizer, or maybe you ordered a new piece of equipment, and still it doesn't take. I mean, come on, that posture strap set you ordered from overseas had great reviews, right? So why isn't your posture perfect? I totally know the feeling, and that actually is based off my own personal story. I ordered one of those posture straps. I forget the country. The box came, it was crushed and already opened, and sure enough, I tried once and couldn't figure out how to use the strap. And so, products are rarely the answer. And today, we're really going to tackle this first part. Why your current approach to building or breaking habits is probably not working for you or not lasting to be a sustainable change. So for this multi-part series, I'm going to use an anchor text. I always like to bring a text into this and bring you quotes from folks who have really dove deep into these different topics and provided some research. So for this, mini series, so to speak, around habits, I'm going to be using James Clear's bestseller, Atomic Habits, which you may have heard of. Clear's book is really an amazing, practical, and helpful guide to both how habits work. And I'm also going to use the frameworks alongside some of the strategies that I use with my own clients to really help us dig in and help you start taking some action. One additional reason I'm using Clear's book is because he's actually done a really nice job of incorporating and referencing some of the other top authors on the subject of habits. So folks like Charles Duhigg and his book, The Power of Habits. There's a guy named Nir Eyal who his book is called Hooked. I also recommend Adam Alter's book, Anatomy of a Breakthrough. These are all fantastic books about habits and they address different nuances. But what I love about Clear's book is that it provides a great foundation, and he openly cites these other authors and incorporates their teachings and their research into his overarching framework. Most of all, though, is the reason I choose Clear's book is because he gets at a core fundamental issue that I think a lot of us overlook and really is the critical piece of building or breaking habits. And that is exactly where we're going to start with this episode today. And so in order to build or break a habit, you have to start at the bottom, at the core. And it might not be what you think, but what we're going to first talk about is identity. Identity is the critical piece of building or breaking habits. So let's dive into that. Okay, so when most of us set goals for ourselves, we focus only on the outcomes we're trying to achieve, right? The actual goals. We want to lose weight, we want to publish a book, we want to run a marathon, maybe we want to start a company. And that honestly is where usually our habits, things go wrong from the start. And so what Clear gives us is a general framework for thinking about different layers of change, as he calls it. So at our core, we have identity. So that's who we are, what our beliefs are, our worldview, our assumptions, our biases. And as we're going to see, that's literally the most critical thing. Then at the level above that, a second layer of change is process changes. So this is where our habits and our routines, our systems come into play. And then at the top, most surface level, are outcomes. And this is where the story begins, because most of us only think about the outcomes, right? We only think about, I want to lose those 5 pounds, or I want to publish a book, or I want to run a marathon in 6 months. And that is really where our initial attempts at changing who we are go wrong. Because you think about it, what's the most common thing when we talk about losing weight or putting on a new diet? You lose the weight and then you gain it back, right? Or if maybe you want to publish a book, maybe you write a few pages, but you never get around to finishing it. Or, in my case, I bought a guitar. I even paid for some lessons, try to get myself to commit to that change by putting some money behind it. And yeah, I did some lessons. I learned some chords. I practiced for a bit, but I never actually made it over that hump and really got into it. And so the question is really, why is that? And so we want to reverse it. Instead of starting with outcomes, we want to start at the bottom with identity. Because at the end of the day, we are all really driven by our own worldview and how we see ourselves and what we believe about ourselves. It's really at this level where almost all personal, sustainable growth must start, with your beliefs. In my growth mentality programs and coaching work, this is always where I try to get to. And it usually takes a little while, it takes some conversation, because most of us don't think in terms of identity. We think on the surface. We think in terms of what we're doing, what we're trying to achieve, and we don't really go deeper into that core because it's just not an easy and comfortable place to even get down to. Like, how do you even start to access your identity? We're going to get into that, but I want to share with you a couple of quotes from Atomic Habits, again, by James Clear. This will be our anchor text throughout this multi-part series. And he does a really great job of articulating this point, so I could try to articulate it myself, but his writing is so clear that I just really, really love it. So I'm going to share a couple of quotes that really get to the core of why focusing on shifting your identity is most important when trying to build or break habits, as opposed to starting with the goals. So here's quote 1. Clear says, quote, "Many people begin the process of changing their habits by focusing on what they want to achieve. This leads us to outcome-based habits. The alternative is to build identity-based habits. With this approach, we start by focusing on who we wish to become." And now that's that last sentence there. With this approach, we start by focusing on who we wish to become. That, if there was one sentence to sum up identity over outcomes, that is it. When you're trying to break or build a habit, you really need to ask yourself the larger question. Who are you trying to become? What kind of person are you trying to grow into? That is how behavior change happens. And so to build off that, here's a second quote from Clear's book. And honestly, this is all from just the first third of the book. This is one of the reasons I wanted to break this out into multiple episodes, because ultimately behavior change is so important to growth. And I really didn't feel like I could I feel like it would be a disservice to try to put this all into one. So again, you got to start by focusing on not what you're trying to achieve, but who you wish to become. And here's a second quote to kind of unpack that a little bit. So Clear writes, quote, "True behavior change is identity change. You might start a habit because of motivation, but the only reason you'll stick with one is that it becomes part of your identity. Anyone can convince themselves to visit the gym or eat healthy once or twice, but if you don't shift the belief behind the behavior, then it is hard to stick with long-term changes. Improvements are only temporary until they become part of who you are. The goal is not to read a book. The goal is to become a reader. The goal is not to run a marathon. The goal is to become a runner. The goal is not to learn an instrument. The goal is to become a musician. Your behaviors are usually a reflection of your identity. What you do is an indication of the type of person you believe that you are, either consciously or unconsciously. And so once you believe in a particular aspect of yourself, you actually become, and there's research that bears this out, you actually become much more likely to act in alignment with that identity. So to finish Clear's quote, he says, quote, "The person who incorporates exercise into their identity doesn't have to convince themselves to train. Doing the right thing is easy. After all, when your behavior and your identity are aligned, you are no longer pursuing behavior change. You are simply acting like the type of person you already believe yourself to be." Now, this all sounds really nice, and I bet you can think of personal examples that actually this makes total sense for. So I'll give you a personal example for me. I love to read. I read books all the time. It's one of the reasons I love to bring them into this podcast, and will continue to do so, because reading is something that I don't even know how I got into it initially. I think it's something that in my family I saw it a lot. And then I found the types of books and types of writing that I like to read. And now, if you ask anybody who knows me, they'll tell you that this is probably one of the core facets of my identity, is that I am very much a reader. I put it in my resume. I put it on intro slides for my workshops, just because I really love it. And the more that I reinforce that and the more pride I feel in that, then the more solidified it becomes as part of my identity. So now, anytime I'm reading, I feel like I'm reinforcing who I am. You probably have habits already that kind of do that. And they can be small, like for instance, maybe you floss every day. So you are someone who flosses, someone who takes care of their teeth, right? You brush your teeth twice a day, same idea. They don't all have to be profound. They don't have to be about, crazy big ideas or big things. But you already have an identity. And so it's made up of these different habits that either reinforce it or undermine it. And so that's really going to be the key to building and breaking habits, is figuring out what is your current identity, why is it that way, and what identity do you need to grow into in order to achieve ultimately what you're trying to achieve. Now, again, identity comes down to beliefs. How do you see the world? What do you believe about yourself and your self-image in the world? What are the assumptions, the biases? And so at this point, you might be nodding along and saying, okay, I buy this. Like, I got to, become the person who does these things, as opposed to just doing these things in hopes that I, keep doing them. But you might also recognize an underlying question about beliefs. If this is all about what I believe about myself, then how do you build or change beliefs? Now, that is a really important question. So let's dive into beliefs. How do you actually build or change beliefs, and where do they come from? All right, so when we're talking about beliefs, let's first understand what a belief really is. A belief is a combination of memories, things that have happened to us that we can recall, things that maybe have happened in the world around us or that we've seen. And then it's also the stories that we build with those memories. And that's really, these memories, you can think of them as evidence. And it's a term that Clear used a lot in his book, is evidence. Every time something happens, a lot of times we log it as evidence of certain things being true or not true about the world and about ourselves. Tony Robbins likes to use a table analogy that I really like. This idea that the tabletop is the belief, and then every leg you put under it is a different memory or story that supports that belief. So let's use a basic example to start. So maybe you are someone who considers yourself to be bad with directions. And so when you think, oh, I'm bad with directions, this is something I think about myself. I'm actually not great with directions for some reason. I tell myself that, and this is a narrative that I have about myself. Now, it's fairly innocuous, right? This isn't going to make me upset or elated. It's something small, but now anytime I have to change directions or I look directions, I think about past times where I've gotten lost, or I've taken the wrong exit, or I made the wrong turn. And then it just reinforces this now underlying belief that I am bad with directions. Same thing, another little example that comes up for people often is around like being organized. A lot of people will say to themselves, oh, I'm just not an organized person, because, and then they think back to, oh, I have a pile of stuff next to my bed, or I forgot to do this thing last night, and I keep forgetting things every single day. And so what you don't realize is that it's not the instance that's dictating the belief. It's actually a mutually reinforcing cycle. So the more you tell yourself that you're disorganized, or you don't know, you're not good with directions, the more things will happen to actually reinforce that. And you might think that that sounds a little sort of puff psychology or pseudo psychology or whatever it is, but it's actually very true. And there's real research behind this. Actually, in future episodes, I'm going to dive into something called learned optimism. But if you ever want to look that up, they've done extensive research about how the stories that we tell ourselves end up affecting our success and affecting what we choose to do. I've also done a whole series on imposter syndrome, because this is also very related to that. When you're building or breaking habits, you're oftentimes trying to become or undo some part of your identity. When people are dealing with imposter syndrome, a lot of times what they do is you pick out selective evidence of your, belief that you are an imposter. So maybe the one slide you flubbed, or the time that you showed up late for work, or you forgot a deadline. And what you also do is you ignore all of the other evidence in support of who you are as a capable professional, or whatever it is that you believe you're actually an imposter of. We have really extensive and impressive memories, but they're selective. And if you sit right now and think about what are some of the memories you play over and over and over, you'll realize that you've probably played those same memories in your head thousands of times. And replaying memories is what reinforces beliefs and then reinforces the identity that those beliefs are supporting. And so it's really, honestly, it can be kind of a mind-blowing revelation to think about the sheer amount of time you have spent replaying one singular memory that's happened in your life over and over and over. And I'll give you a quick example. It's going to sound a little silly, and if you know me personally, you may recall this event in my own life. But there's one memory when I was a kid. I was an athlete growing up. I played sports a lot. I love sports. I was very competitive. And I have this memory when I was, I think in it must have been, I don't know, 5th grade, 6th grade, something like that. When I was in the local intramural basketball league, and I made the all-star team. And in the all-star game, it was a close game. It came, everybody was there. All these kids, and we're all at that age where you kind of are mean to each other, but you also know each other and have fun. But anyways, fast forward, at the end of the game, the time's running out. I'm on the court. We're down 1 point. I grab a rebound and put up a quick shot as time expires, and I get fouled. Now, if you know basketball, when you get fouled, you get free throws. So you get 2 free shots from the foul line. And, again, I think I was like 10 or 11. I was not great at shooting foul shots at the time. Plus, in front of everybody, in front of a huge crowd, I'm very nervous. And this is to win the game, but also to potentially lose the game since we're down 1 point. Now, naturally, I missed both shots, right? And we ended up losing the game. So I did that in front of everybody. And obviously, a lot of the kids came up and had their things to say to me. And, that is one of those memories that I can tell you specifically I replayed, especially when it came to athletics, over and over and over again. And I used it as one of several memories to kind of prop up this negative belief in myself that I was good but not quite good enough, or that I was not really a winner. I was always coming in second. And it's really an absurd thing to convince yourself, especially when you think about how you frame memory. So the important thing about that specific example, which I honestly did not plan to share in this, but I felt like in the moment it was necessary. The things that we do to ourselves in this case, for instance. So with that memory, what did I ignore? What evidence am I ignoring? How about the fact that I was an all-star, right? I was in the all-star game, so I was already selected to be one of the best players in the league. And not only that, I was in the game on the final play. So clearly I was deemed to be good enough to be in the game at the most critical point. And then, of course, lastly, I got the rebound and created the opportunity to even try to tie and win the game. But these are things that we don't necessarily give ourselves grace or compassion with. And instead, you create one, you take that memory, you build a narrative around it. I'm not good enough in this case. And then you just replay that. And anytime you're not good enough again, you've got that first memory, and then you stack it with all these other memories. And eventually you get to a place where you've got a whole belief based around all the negative things or the letdowns. But what you're ignoring is all of the other things that you've done in your life. And so that's why beliefs and identity, when we're thinking about building new habits, is so, so critical, because this is really about building and compiling evidence. It's to build a new habit and to reshape your identity, and to also undo negative identities and negative self-beliefs. You really have to compile and create evidence. And so sometimes it starts with looking back in your memories and thinking about all the times you've had success, or all the times you've done the thing aligned to the identity you want. I'm going to go back to a quote here from Clear, because I think he, again, puts this so nicely. So Clear says, "Your identity emerges out of your habits. You were not born with preset beliefs. Every belief, including those about yourself, is learned and conditioned through experience. More precisely, your habits are how you embody your identity. When you make your bed each day, you embody the identity of an organized person. When you write each day, you embody the identity of a creative person. When you train each day, you embody the identity of an athletic person. The more you repeat a behavior, the more you reinforce the identity associated with that behavior. So in this way, the process of building habits is actually the process of becoming yourself." Now, that's a really awesome and profound last sentence. I'll say it one more time. In this way, the process of building habits is actually the process of becoming yourself. So like I said, you've got to go about compiling existing evidence and creating new evidence. And building and breaking habits is critical in doing that. That's where the evidence comes from. So before we close out part one here, I want to spend the last few minutes also addressing some of the common doubts you might have, and also some of the dangers around identity, because identity cuts both ways. And knowing and avoiding or overcoming these common pitfalls can really be the difference between success and failure when it comes to building and breaking habits, and ultimately realizing that new identity of who you're trying to grow into. So let's get into the dangers and the pitfalls, and some of the doubts you're probably having around using identity as the core of building and breaking habits. All right, so when we're talking about the pitfalls or doubts and dangers around this identity-based thinking, and setting the foundation for building and breaking habits, there are three things I really want to mention before we close out this first part. Again, this is going to be a multi-part series about building and breaking habits. In the next episode, I'm going to actually go into the details about what a habit is, how it's formed, and kind of the cycle of habits, so you can really get tactical and practical. But first, I want to kind of warn you, or put a yellow light up about three specific things related to this. The first I've already sort of referenced, which is identities and habits really are not just physical habits, but they're also mental habits, right? Our thought patterns, our narratives that we replay, these sometimes negative things, negative stories, those are also habits, and they are based in our identity, how we view ourselves. And so having, beliefs can work in both ways. If you have negative beliefs about yourself, in coaching parlance, what we call them are self-limiting beliefs, where we, again, like my story about the playing basketball earlier, is you have these negative beliefs about yourself, and then you back them with negative stories and memories. They are called self-limiting beliefs because they're literally limiting your growth by making you believe you're not capable of such growth, which is why the compiling of evidence process is so important, because you can unlearn some of the negative beliefs once you start building up new beliefs and you replace the old ones and you get the old memories kind of out of your mind. You de-arm them, right? You're the only one playing them. If you tuned into one of my earlier episodes about feeling unworthy, we talk a little bit about this and how to try to skip that track or change the station, so to speak, when you have the same recurring thoughts. So that's just one thing to keep in mind, is that when we're talking about building and breaking habits and underlying identities, we're also not just talking about what you do physically in physical space and time, but we're also talking about what goes on in your head. So the thoughts that you have, the stories that you tell yourself, they're all connected. And it's important to recognize that we can have mental habits too. And so I'll try to speak more on that later, but I wanted to call that out. There's two other sort of dangers to think about when it comes to identities, though. The first is what I'll call moving identity goalposts. So you might have listened to this up to this point and say to yourself, well, sure, Ian, like I can write every day, but that doesn't actually make me a writer. I have to be a published writer. I have to have people actually want to read what I write, and what I'll say to you is that is your culture talking. That is not the definition of what a writer is. Now, if you want to be a professional writer or perhaps a successful writer in the modern sense of that word, or however you define successful, maybe you need compensation or maybe you need recognition. But being paid or getting recognized are goals or outcomes, right? They're not part of the underlying identity. These are things that could happen as a result of you being a writer, but they are not what defines someone as being a writer, because they're not required to be a writer. You don't have to get paid to be a writer. If you write every day, then you are a writer, right? It's like you think about Vincent van Gogh, right? Very famous artist today. And if you know anything about his history, he died a tragic death and in poverty. And it's because when he was alive, he only sold or traded a couple of paintings. He never achieved wealth and he never achieved notoriety. So if you're going to sit there and tell me that because Vincent van Gogh wasn't rich and famous when he was alive, does that mean he wasn't a painter? Obviously not, right? It just means he wasn't rich or famous. He wasn't a rich or famous painter during his life. And I doubt that he really considered either of those things terribly connected to whether he was a painter or not. And so when you are trying to reinforce an identity of yourself or build a new one, try to avoid adding in those what I'll call modifiers, adding the terms like successful or rich or famous or published or whatever. When you're first getting started, it's really doing yourself a disservice to try to add in those goalpost modifiers, because honestly, what you're probably doing is a form of self-sabotage. By putting the goalpost so far out there, it's like if I don't know how to play the piano, and if I said I want to play the piano because I want to be the world's best pianist, like that is a pretty far off goalpost. How about first, I want to be a musician that plays the piano? You start smaller to get yourself going. Maybe you develop goals eventually, but you really don't want them to hold you back or to undermine what you've already been able to accomplish, because that is really what's important here. A lot of times, we're building up to something, and then because we don't believe in ourselves, we undercut what we're doing or all of the progress we've made or all of the things that we've done. When in reality, this is about putting together small wins over and over and over. There's a quote here from Clear that I'll share where he says, each habit is like a suggestion. Quote, hey, maybe this is who I am. If you finish a book, then perhaps you're the type of person who likes reading. If you go to the gym, then perhaps you are the type of person who likes exercise. If you practice playing guitar, perhaps you're the type of person who likes music. He says, every action you take is a vote for the type of person you wish to become. And it's important to remember, nobody's perfect. No person on the planet is perfect. This is about winning the majority of the time, voting for that identity the majority of the time, which is where building the habits comes from and the power of it. So I mentioned how you can have sort of negative identities and self-beliefs. You can have moving your identity goalposts. The last thing I just want to call out that I think is important to think about is having identities that are too rigid. So a lot of us, when we develop an identity for ourselves, we get really, really entrenched in it, and we start to feel a lot of pride in it, and that's all great. The challenge becomes when you get too inflexible in an identity, you actually risk stopping growth and evolution, which can then lead to things that undermine that identity, or, God forbid, something happens that takes that identity away from you. It can leave you in a very vulnerable spot, and really a lot of people have a tough time changing identities when something drastic happens. So I'll give you a couple of quick examples. You think about, and again, personal example here too, an entrepreneur who starts a company, they're the founder and CEO of that company. And, if you look on LinkedIn and you look at all their stuff, that's probably all they talk about all day long. It's really, so many of us who have founded companies, that becomes your identity. You are the company. But that is a very, very dangerous and dare I say, not a very productive way to view the entire endeavor. Because what happens is when or if that company goes bust, and most of them do, your identity as a founder, all of a sudden, it's really hard to reground yourself. So you have a tough time figuring out who you are, what you stand for, what you care about, because you spent so much time being only about that company. Now, there's some people in the entrepreneurship world who actually advise startups and founders to refer to their company as a separate entity. So when they pitch it to people, it's like, what do you think about this as a company? Or what do you think about this concept as a product versus saying my product or our company? Because if you get your identity so intertwined and then things don't go your way for whatever reason, it might not even be your fault, it can really have a devastating emotional impact. Other examples, you think about why divorce can be such a really emotionally powerful and destabilizing experience is because, if you're in a relationship and become a spouse, you identify as a spouse, you identify as someone who's married, and your whole world is built around that identity. Same thing you think about a pro athlete. If they've been playing a singular sport their entire lives and then they have a career-ending injury, that can lead to some very, very drastic emotional experiences. And so when you are trying to build a new identity, I challenge you to approach it in sort of a flexible way. Don't focus so much on the specifics, but more the general. So you want to be a musician versus you want to be, the best piano player alive or whatever it may be. Having that flexibility will really allow you to kind of go with the flow that is life, because nothing's perfect. You're going to have setbacks. You're going to have things that undercut or try to sabotage. And honestly, unlearning a lot of our beliefs also takes a lot of time and requires a lot of resilience. So those are just a few things I wanted to leave you with to think about and just be wary of. But ultimately, building and breaking habits and starting with the identity is the core of the whole process, and it's an extremely empowering way to go about this. So moving forward, your next steps, focus on who you are trying to become, right? And start with your goals. You can still start with the goals and just work backwards. So if you want to be able to build a company, then work backwards. What kind of person builds a company? What kind of person learns an instrument? What kind of person runs a marathon? And get to the core. Is it a runner, or is it a musician, an entrepreneur? And then start thinking about that and start really trying to get into that mode. The reason I didn't want to cram in how to build a habit into this episode is because I think people do themselves a disservice by not putting enough time into thinking through who they are trying to become. That is the important question. That is the North Star, and that is the thing that will make these changes that we end up building and breaking habits with, that will make them last. And so the other thing I'll give you, so first is really spend some time thinking deeply about who you're trying to become. And again, you can work backwards from goals you might have to determine what kind of person would achieve such goals. I'd also push you to start thinking about beliefs you have about yourself, whether they're positive or negative. That's really important too, because these beliefs are what you're going to build on or what you're going to have to unlearn and then build again. So if you have trouble thinking about, how do I know what I believe about myself? Here's a easy way to start working on it. Is you can start by trying to write down common things you say to yourself in your head. When you stub your toe, or when you forget something, or when you do something great, like what are the things that you tell yourself? Try to jot a few of those down, because typically they have beliefs sort of embedded in them or underlying them. And once you kind of have a sense for those, again, positive and negative, because we have a mixture of both, that'll really help you set the foundation for what's coming next, which is how to actually build the habits in practice and get closer to that person you're trying to become. So next time we'll dive into how habits actually work so you can start building and breaking the ones you need to in order to grow into the person you want to be. In the meantime, thanks for tuning in. Remember that life is too short to not believe and invest in yourself and your own growth. I appreciate you guys tuning in for this one. Can't wait for the next episode around building and breaking habits, and we will see you next time. Hey friends, before you go, I want to tell you about one more free coaching resource called The Gas Up. It is my weekly coaching email I send out every Sunday evening to help you get engaged and ready for the week ahead. You can sign up now using the link in the show notes or follow me on Instagram at Ian Scott Cohen to find the link in my bio. And if you forget, you can always find all this information and more about my coaching programs at www.ianscottcohen.com. Thanks again for tuning in to the Growth Coach podcast, and we'll see you next time.